I'm Alex Chen, and 3 months ago I walked into Thompson's Auto Repair, thinking I was just getting my transmission fixed. I had no idea I was about to hand over $800 for a $200 job, all because a greedy mechanic took one look at my thrift store clothes and beat up Honda and decided I was an easy target. What he didn't know was that in 2 weeks, I'd be signing the lease agreement as his landlord's new business partner, and his little shop would be facing eviction if he couldn't explain why he'd been systematically scamming customers like me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I was running on 3 hours of sleep and my second cup of gas station coffee, rushing to make it to my job interview at Riverside Community Development. I'd just graduated with my MBA from Oakwood Community College, and this position could finally be my shot at launching the consulting firm I'd been dreaming about since sophomore year. My Honda Civic, a 2010 model I'd bought used 3 years earlier, had been making this grinding noise for weeks, but I kept putting off the repair because every dollar mattered when you're living on student loans and part-time work. That Tuesday morning, the grinding turned into a full-on mechanical scream as I pulled into the parking lot of the business complex. The transmission gave one final shudder and refused to shift out of park. I sat there for a moment, watching other candidates in their crisp suits walking confidently toward the building, while I calculated how much money I had left in my checking account and whether I could afford to miss this interview. The interview itself went better than I'd hoped. Margaret Rodriguez, the director of the development program, was this sharp woman in her 50s who'd built her commercial real estate empire from nothing. She grilled me for 45 minutes about market analysis and small business development strategies, and I could tell she was impressed when I broke down the demographic shifts happening in Riverside's industrial corridor. When she walked me out, she mentioned they'd be making their decision within the week, and that the position came with opportunities to partner on some exciting new ventures. But none of that mattered if I couldn't get my car fixed and keep showing up. I called 3 different shops from the parking lot, and Thompson's Auto Repair was the only one that could squeeze me in that afternoon. The woman on the phone, Linda, sounded friendly enough and assured me they'd take good care of me. Thompson's Auto Repair sat on a narrow lot between a tire shop and a payday loan store on Industrial Boulevard, the kind of street where the businesses all had metal grating over their windows, and the sidewalks were cracked from too much heavy traffic and not enough city maintenance. The building itself was a converted gas station from maybe the 70s, with 2 service bays and a small office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the place opened. I pulled into the lot around 2 in the afternoon, and the car barely made it to the service area before the transmission gave up completely. A man in his 40s emerged from under the hood of a pickup truck, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. He was average height with thinning brown hair and the kind of permanent oil stains under his fingernails that come from years of engine work. "You must be the Honda," he said, not bothering to introduce himself or even make eye contact. "Rick Thompson. What's she doing?" I explained about the grinding noise and the transmission problems, trying to sound knowledgeable enough that he wouldn't assume I was completely clueless about cars. My dad had taught me basic maintenance before he passed away when I was in high school, and I'd watched enough YouTube videos to understand the basics of what was probably wrong. Rick popped the hood and spent maybe 3 minutes looking around before shaking his head. "Yeah, transmission's shot. Gonna need a full rebuild. This is an older car, probably not worth putting that much money into it." My stomach dropped. "How much are we talking about?" "Full rebuild's gonna run you somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000, depending on what else we find when we get in there." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't have $1,500. I barely had enough to cover my rent next month. "Is there any way to do something temporary? Just enough to get it running safely until I can save up for the full repair?" Rick shrugged. "I mean, I could patch it up, but you'd be looking at the same problem again in a few months. Better to do it right the first time." That's when I heard the raised voices coming from the office area. Through the glass door, I could see an elderly man in work clothes gesturing emphatically at the receptionist. Linda, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, was clearly trying to calm him down, but his voice kept getting louder. 40 years I've been coming here, and now you want to charge me $300 for an oil change? That's highway robbery." Without really thinking about it, I walked toward the office. The man, who had to be in his 70s, was leaning heavily on a cane and looked like he was about to either collapse or start throwing things. Linda kept glancing toward the service bay, probably hoping Rick would come deal with the situation, but he was conspicuously focused on my engine. "Excuse me," I said, stepping into the office. "I couldn't help but overhear. Mr. Martinez," the man said, turning to me with tired eyes. "Carlos Martinez. And I don't know who you are, but unless you're the owner of this place, I don't think you can help me." I glanced at the paperwork he was clutching. From what I could see, it was an estimate for what looked like a basic oil change and fluid top-off, but the total at the bottom made my eyes widen. $328. "May I?" I asked, gesturing to the paper. Carlos handed it over and I scanned the itemized list. 30-quart oil change, $45. That was reasonable. But then there were charges for transmission fluid flush at $85, brake fluid replacement at $60, power steering service at $55, and something called engine diagnostic fee for $95. "Mr. Martinez," I said carefully, "did you ask for all these services? Or just the oil change?" "Just the oil change," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I bring my truck here every 6 months, same thing every time. Today this young lady tells me they found all these other problems that need fixing right away, or my truck's gonna break down." I looked at Linda, who was studiously avoiding eye contact. "And these other services, they're all necessary immediately?" Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Rick did the inspection and said everything needed attention." "Uh-huh." I turned back to Carlos. "Mr. Martinez, when's the last time you had your transmission fluid changed?" "Maybe 2 years ago," he said. "Truck runs fine. No problem shifting, no leaks in my driveway." I nodded and walked back to the service bay, where Rick was now leaning against my car scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me, Rick. The gentleman in the office, Mr. Martinez. Did his truck actually need all those services you recommended?" Rick looked up with an expression that was half annoyance, half surprise. "I don't discuss other customers' business. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if an elderly man on a fixed income really needs to spend $300 today on services he didn't request, or if maybe some of those could wait." "Look, lady," Rick said, straightening up and crossing his arms. "I don't know who you think you are, but I've been doing this for 20 years. If I say a vehicle needs service, it needs service. Even if the customer specifically said he only wanted an oil change?" Rick's jaw tightened. "Safety is safety. I'm not going to send someone out of here with a death trap just because they don't want to pay for proper maintenance." I stared at him for a long moment, then walked back to the office where Carlos was still standing with his paperwork, looking defeated. "Mr. Martinez, do you have another shop you trust?" "My usual guy retired last year," Carlos said. "That's why I started coming here." "Well, here's what I think," I said loud enough that Rick could hear me from the service bay. "I think you should pay for your oil change, which should cost about $45 plus tax, and take your truck somewhere else for a second opinion on everything else." Linda. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Carlos straightened up a little. "You think they're trying to rip me off? I think 30 quarts of oil costs about $45, and the rest of those services should have been discussed with you before they were added to your bill." Rick appeared in the doorway between the office and the service bay. "Ma'am, I'm gonna have to ask you not to interfere with my business." "I'm not interfering," I said calmly. "I'm helping a customer understand his options. Carlos has been happy with our service for years." Carlos snorted. "Happy?" "Son, I've been tolerating your service because my options were limited." "But this young lady's right. You never charged me for stuff I didn't ask for before." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Linda was frantically typing something on her computer, probably trying to look busy. Rick's face was getting red, and I could see him deciding whether to back down or escalate. "Tell you what," I said to Carlos. "What if I drive you to AutoZone so you can get the oil and filter yourself, and then we find someone who'll do the change for a fair price?" "You'd do that for me?" Carlos asked. Of course. Rick stepped closer. Lady, you're way out of line here. Carlos, if you walk out that door without getting this work done, don't come crying to me when your truck breaks down on the freeway. My truck was running fine when I drove it in here 30 minutes ago, Carlos said, his voice getting stronger. And it'll be running fine when I drive it somewhere else. That's when Danny Thompson, Rick's younger brother, emerged from the second service bay. Danny was maybe 30, with the same thinning hair as Rick, but a gentler demeanor. He'd been working quietly on a Camaro the whole time, but apparently he'd been listening to everything. Rick, Danny said quietly, maybe we should just charge Mr. Martinez for the oil change and let him think about the other stuff. Rick whirled on his brother. Stay out of this, Danny. You don't know what you're talking about. I know Mr. Martinez has been coming here for 3 years and never had any complaints, Danny said. And I know his truck doesn't need a transmission flush. The office went dead silent. Linda stopped typing. Carlos straightened up completely. I felt a little surge of satisfaction that someone else was willing to speak up. Excuse me? Rick said, his voice dangerously quiet. Danny swallowed hard but didn't back down. His transmission fluid is fine, Rick. I checked it myself when he first got here. It's clean, it's at the right level, and there's no indication of any problems. You checked it without my permission? I check all the fluids on every car that comes in. That's my job. Rick looked like he was about to explode. Carlos looked from Danny to Rick and back again. So you're saying I don't need all this extra work? Danny glanced at his brother, then at Carlos. Mr. Martinez, your truck needs an oil change. That's it. Everything else on that estimate can wait at least 6 months, probably longer. I wanted to hug Danny Thompson right there. Instead, I turned to Carlos. There you go. Straight from the mechanic who actually looked at your truck. Carlos handed the estimate back to Linda. Change this to just the oil change. Linda looked at Rick, who was staring daggers at his brother. Rick? Fine, Rick said through gritted teeth. Just the oil change. While Linda processed Carlos's new, much smaller bill, I waited in the office, watching Rick storm around the service bay like a caged animal. Danny went back to work on the Camaro, but I could see his hands shaking slightly as he worked. When Carlos's truck was ready, he tried to slip me $20 for helping him out, but I refused. You didn't deserve to be taken advantage of, I told him. I just helped you stand up for yourself. Carlos smiled and pressed a business card into my hand. I own a small restaurant downtown. You ever need a good meal, you come see me. On the house. After Carlos left, Rick finally turned his attention back to my car. His whole demeanor had changed. Where he'd been merely indifferent before, now he seemed actively hostile. So, he said, slamming my hood shut harder than necessary. About your transmission. What about it? Like I said, it's gonna need a full rebuild. But after that little stunt you just pulled, I'm thinking maybe you should take your business elsewhere. I felt my heart rate pick up. Are you refusing to work on my car because I helped another customer? I'm refusing to work on your car because I don't like your attitude. My attitude? You came in here acting like you know something about cars. Then you interfered with my business and cost me money. I didn't cost you money. I prevented you from overcharging an elderly man. Rick stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of motor oil and something else, maybe alcohol. Listen here, college girl. I can tell just by looking at you that you think you're smarter than everyone else. You drive a beat-up Honda, you're wearing clothes from Goodwill, and you probably don't have 2 nickels to rub together. But you want to come in here and tell me how to run my business? The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they weren't partially true. I was broke, and my clothes were mostly second-hand, but because of the venom in his voice when he said it. Whether or not I have money doesn't give you the right to cheat people, I said, proud that my voice stayed steady. Cheat people? Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sweetheart, this is a business, not a charity. I charge what the work is worth, and if you can't afford quality service, maybe you should learn to take the bus. Danny appeared again, this time looking genuinely distressed. Rick, come on. There's no need for that. There's every need for that, Rick snapped. I'm tired of people like her coming in here thinking they can negotiate with me like I'm running a flea market. People like her. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. You know what? I said, pulling my keys out of my purse. You're right. I should take my business elsewhere. Good luck getting that transmission rebuilt for less than what I quoted you, Rick called after me as I headed for the door. And good luck finding someone willing to work on a car that old. I made it to my car before the shaking started. The engine turned over, and by some miracle, the transmission engaged long enough for me to limp out of Thompson's parking lot. I drove slowly, carefully to the AutoZone 2 blocks away and sat in their parking lot for 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of my brain knew I should call around to other shops, get quotes, figure out my options. But the emotional part of my brain was stuck on Rick's words. College girl, beat-up Honda, Goodwill clothes, people like her. I'd spent the last 4 years working my way through business school, juggling classes with 2 part-time jobs and an internship that paid barely enough to cover gas money. I'd graduated summa cum laude, written a thesis on small business development that my professor said was graduate-level work, and landed an interview for a position that could change my entire career trajectory. But Rick Thompson had taken one look at me and decided I was just another broke kid who didn't deserve basic respect. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan Kim, my study partner from business school, and one of my closest friends. How did the interview go? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Good, I think. Car broke down afterward, though. Yikes, need help? Working on it. What I didn't tell Jordan was that I was sitting in an AutoZone parking lot, fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. I didn't tell her that I had exactly $437 in my checking account, and no idea how I was going to afford the transmission repair that would probably cost more than my car was worth. Instead, I went into AutoZone and bought a bottle of transmission fluid and some stop leak additive. The teenager behind the counter was kind enough to help me add both to my car, and miraculously, the grinding noise quieted to a whisper. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it might buy me a few weeks to figure out a real solution. As I drove home to my studio apartment, I kept thinking about Carlos Martinez and the way his shoulders had sagged when he thought he had no choice but to pay for services he didn't need. I thought about Danny Thompson, who'd risked his brother's anger to tell the truth about a customer's car. And I thought about Rick Thompson, who'd looked at my clothes and my car and decided that gave him the right to treat me like I was beneath his notice. What Rick didn't know, couldn't have known, was that in my purse was Margaret Rodriguez's business card, and on that card was a handwritten note. Call me Thursday. I think we should talk about the partnership opportunity I mentioned. What Rick didn't know was that Margaret Rodriguez owned half the commercial real estate on Industrial Boulevard, including the building that housed Thompson's auto repair. And what Rick definitely didn't know was that his lease was up for renewal in 6 weeks, and Margaret Rodriguez was looking for a business partner who understood customer service, community development, and the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of how much money they appeared to have. But he was about to find out. Margaret Rodriguez called me Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, just as she'd promised. I was in my apartment, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and trying to work up the courage to call more transmission shops, when my phone buzzed with her number. Alex, I hope you don't mind me calling so early, Margaret said, her voice carrying that same decisive energy I'd noticed during the interview. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'd like to move forward with bringing you on board. Can you meet me for lunch today? There's something specific I want to discuss. My heart jumped. Of course. Where would you like to meet? Corner Coffee and More on Main Street. Noon work for you? I spent the rest of the morning trying on different combinations of my limited professional wardrobe, eventually settling on black slacks and a blue blouse that I'd bought for graduation. My Honda made it to the restaurant without any major protests, though I could hear the transmission whispering its complaints every time I shifted gears. Corner Coffee and More was the kind of place where Riverside's business community gathered for informal meetings. The walls were lined with local artwork, and most of the tables were occupied by people in suits having intense conversations over laptops and legal pads. Margaret was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, wearing a tailored burgundy jacket and reviewing a stack of paperwork. Alex, perfect timing. she said, standing to shake my hand. I took the liberty of ordering you a coffee. Black, right? That's what you had during the interview. I was impressed that she'd noticed and remembered such a small detail. We spent the first few minutes catching up on small talk, but I could tell Margaret had something important on her mind. She kept glancing at the papers in front of her and checking her watch. So, she said finally, leaning forward slightly, I'll cut right to the chase. The position we discussed is yours if you want it, but I also have a proposal that might interest you even more. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were architectural drawings, financial projections, and what looked like a comprehensive business plan. I'm developing a new commercial complex on the east side of town, Margaret continued. Retail space, office suites, service businesses. The anchor tenant is going to be a state-of-the-art automotive service center. Full diagnostic equipment, certified technicians, transparent pricing, customer lounge with Wi-Fi and coffee. The works. I looked up from the papers, trying to process what she was suggesting. It sounds amazing, but I'm not sure how I fit into this. I need a business partner who understands customer service and community development. Someone who can help me recruit the right tenants, develop customer-focused policies, and build relationships with the local business community. Margaret paused, her eyes serious. I also need someone who understands what it's like to be underestimated because of how you look or what you drive. The comment caught me off guard. I'm not sure what you mean. Margaret smiled. Alex, I've been in commercial real estate for 15 years. I started with nothing, and I've had plenty of people assume I didn't belong in the room because I was a woman, or because I was Latina, or because I didn't drive the right car. I recognized the look. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been there. Margaret leaned back in her chair. The question is whether you're interested in doing something about it. This automotive center I'm planning? It's going to be located 2 blocks from Industrial Boulevard. It's going to offer everything the current shops in that area do, but with fair pricing, honest communication, and respect. Call me Thursday. I think we should talk about the partnership opportunity I mentioned. What Rick didn't know was that Margaret Rodriguez owned half the commercial real estate on Industrial Boulevard, including the building that housed Thompson's Auto Repair. And what Rick definitely didn't know was that his lease was up for renewal in 6 weeks, and Margaret Rodriguez was looking for a business partner who understood customer service, community development, and the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of how much money they appeared to have. But he was about to find out. Margaret Rodriguez called me Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, just as she'd promised. I was in my apartment, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee, and trying to work up the courage to call more transmission shops, when my phone buzzed with her number. Alex, I hope you don't mind me calling so early, Margaret said, her voice carrying that same decisive energy I'd noticed during the interview. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'd like to move forward with bringing you on board. Can you meet me for lunch today? There's something specific I want to discuss. My heart jumped. Of course. Where would you like to meet? Corner Coffee and More on Main Street. Noon work for you? I spent the rest of the morning trying on different combinations of my limited professional wardrobe, eventually settling on black slacks and a blue blouse that I'd bought for graduation. My Honda made it to the restaurant without any major protests, though I could hear the transmission whispering its complaints every time I shifted gears. Corner Coffee and More was the kind of place where Riverside's business community gathered for informal meetings. The walls were lined with local artwork, and most of the tables were occupied by people in suits having intense conversations over laptops and legal pads. Margaret was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, wearing a tailored burgundy jacket and reviewing a stack of paperwork. Alex, perfect timing, she said, standing to shake my hand. I took the liberty of ordering you a coffee. Black, right? That's what you had during the interview. I was impressed that she'd noticed and remembered such a small detail. We spent the first few minutes catching up on small talk, but I could tell Margaret had something important on her mind. She kept glancing at the papers in front of her and checking her watch. So, she said finally, leaning forward slightly, I'll cut right to the chase. The position we discussed is yours if you want it. But I also have a proposal that might interest you even more. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were architectural drawings, financial projections, and what looked like a comprehensive business plan. "I'm developing a new commercial complex on the east side of town," Margaret continued. "Retail space, office suites, service businesses. The anchor tenant is going to be a state-of-the-art automotive service center. Full diagnostic equipment, certified technicians, transparent pricing, customer lounge with Wi-Fi and coffee. The works." I looked up from the papers, trying to process what she was suggesting. "It sounds amazing, but I'm not sure how I fit into this. I need a business partner who understands customer service and community development. Someone who can help me recruit the right tenants, develop customer-focused policies, and build relationships with the local business community." Margaret paused, her eyes serious. "I also need someone who understands what it's like to be underestimated because of how you look or what you drive." The comment caught me off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean." Margaret smiled. "Alex, I've been in commercial real estate for 15 years. I started with nothing, and I've had plenty of people assume I didn't belong in the room because I was a woman, or because I was Latina, or because I didn't drive the right car." I recognized the look. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been there. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "The question is whether you're interested in doing something about it. This automotive center I'm planning? It's going to be located 2 blocks from Industrial Boulevard. It's going to offer everything the current shops in that area do, but with fair pricing, honest communication, and respect for every customer who walks through the door." The implications hit me immediately. "You're planning to compete directly with the existing shops." "I'm planning to offer customers a better option. Whether that's competition or just raising the bar, depends on how the existing shops respond." I thought about Rick Thompson and his dismissive attitude, about Carlos Martinez clutching his overpriced estimate, about Danny Thompson's quiet courage in speaking up for what was right. "What kind of partnership are you thinking about?" Margaret opened another folder. 40-60 split to start, with the percentage shifting to 50-50 once you've completed your first year and met certain performance benchmarks. You'd be responsible for business development, tenant relations, and community outreach. I'd handle the real estate development, financing, and regulatory compliance. The numbers on the projected revenue sheet made my eyes widen. Even at 40%, my share would be more money than I'd ever imagined making, especially starting out. But more than that, it was an opportunity to build something meaningful, something that could actually improve people's lives. "I'm very interested," I said carefully. "What's the timeline?" "Construction starts in 6 weeks. We'd want to have our anchor tenants selected and lease agreements signed within a month." Margaret gathered her papers and stood up. "Think about it over the weekend. We can talk details on Monday if you decide you want to move forward." As she walked away, I sat at the table for another 20 minutes, staring at the business plan and trying to wrap my head around the opportunity she'd just offered me. 6 months ago, I'd been working 2 part-time jobs and wondering if I'd ever be able to afford graduate school. Now I was looking at the possibility of becoming a business owner before my 26th birthday. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "Coffee later? I have news about the Valley Tech expansion." I texted back, "Definitely, I have news too." We met at 4 o'clock at our usual spot near campus. Jordan had been my study partner throughout business school, but she was also one of the smartest people I'd ever met when it came to understanding market dynamics and business strategy. If anyone could help me think through Margaret's proposal, it was her. "Okay, Spill," Jordan said the moment I sat down. "You look like someone just offered you a job at Google." I told her everything about the interview, the partnership offer, and the automotive center project. Jordan listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes in the small notebook she always carried. When I finished, she sat back and whistled softly. "Alex, this is incredible. Margaret Rodriguez is a legend in this town. Do you know how many people would kill for an opportunity like this?" "I know it's amazing," I said. "But I keep thinking there has to be a catch." "Why me? I just graduated. I have no real business experience. Why would someone like Margaret want to partner with me?" Jordan leaned forward. "Because you're brilliant, and you're hungry, and you actually care about doing the right thing. Plus, You understand the customer perspective in a way that someone who's always had money might not. That reminded me of Margaret's comment about being underestimated. Do you think it's weird that she specifically mentioned the customer service angle? Like she knew about what happened with my car. What happened with your car? I realized I hadn't told Jordan about the incident at Thompson's Auto Repair. I'd been so focused on the job interview and Margaret's offer that I'd pushed the whole unpleasant experience to the back of my mind. Now I found myself recounting the entire story, from Rick's dismissive attitude to his comment about people like me, to Danny's quiet act of defiance in defense of Carlos Martinez. Jordan's expression grew darker as I talked. Alex, that's not just bad customer service, that's systematic targeting of vulnerable customers. I know. It made me so angry, the way he treated that elderly man. And then when I spoke up, Rick acted like I was the problem. Did you file a complaint anywhere? No, I just wanted to get out of there and forget about it. Jordan pulled out her phone and started typing. What was the name of the shop again? Thompson's Auto Repair. Why? Just curious. Jordan continued typing for a few minutes, then looked up with a frown. Alex, look at this! She turned her phone so I could see the screen. It was a Google review page for Thompson's Auto Repair, and the reviews were overwhelmingly negative. Customer after customer complained about unexpected charges, pressure to authorize expensive repairs, and rude treatment from the owner. 1.8 stars, Jordan said. That's almost impressive in how bad it is. I scrolled through the reviews, recognizing the pattern immediately. Elderly customers charged for services they hadn't requested. Young women pressured into expensive repairs for problems that didn't exist. Anyone driving an older car automatically assumed to be desperate enough to accept whatever price they were quoted. Look at this one, I said, pointing to a review from 3 weeks ago. This woman says Rick charged her $600 to fix a noise that turned out to be a loose belt. She took it to another shop afterward, and they said the belt should have cost $30 to replace. Jordan took her phone back and continued scrolling. And this one. Guy says Rick quoted him $1,200 for brake work. Then when he got a second opinion, the other shop told him his brakes were fine. We sat there for several minutes, reading through review after review of customers who'd been overcharged, intimidated, or outright scammed. The pattern was clear and consistent. Rick Thompson was systematically targeting customers he perceived as vulnerable, whether because of their age, their gender, their car, or their apparent financial situation. You know what this is, right? Jordan said. This is exactly the kind of predatory business practice that your new automotive center could put out of business. I nodded, thinking about Margaret's comment about raising the bar versus competition. Do you think Margaret knows about this? If she owns commercial real estate in that area, she probably knows exactly what's going on. That might be part of why she's so interested in developing an alternative. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Margaret's business plan spread across my kitchen table, trying to process everything I'd learned. The partnership opportunity was real, and it was bigger than anything I'd imagined possible. But it was also directly connected to the humiliating experience I'd had at Thompson's Auto Repair, in ways I was only beginning to understand. My phone rang around 8 o'clock. The number wasn't one I recognized, but I answered anyway. Is this Alex Chen? The voice was male, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Yes, who's calling? This is Carlos Martinez. You helped me at the auto shop the other day. I remembered him immediately. Mr. Martinez, of course. How's your truck running? Runs fine, just like my regular mechanic said it would. Listen, I'm calling because something happened today that I thought you should know about. I felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of something? I was at my restaurant this afternoon when Rick Thompson came in. He seemed to know who I was, knew about what happened at his shop. He asked me a lot of questions about you. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions? Your name, where you work, what kind of car you drive. He seemed real interested in whether you were some kind of investigator or reporter. Carlos paused. I didn't tell him nothing, but he seemed pretty worked up about it. Kept saying you cost him money and made him look bad in front of his employees. I tried to process what Carlos was telling me. Did he say anything else? He asked if I knew how to get in touch with you, said he had some things to discuss. I told him I didn't know nothing about how to reach you, but… Carlos hesitated. Miss Chen, I've been in business for 30 years. I know what trouble looks like. And that man's looking for trouble. After I hung up with Carlos, I sat on my couch feeling increasingly uneasy. Rick Thompson was asking questions about me, trying to track me down. The smart thing would probably be to ignore it, focus on Margaret's partnership offer, and stay as far away from Thompson's auto repair as possible. But something about the situation nagged at me. Rick's reaction seemed disproportionate to what had actually happened. I'd helped another customer understand his bill and suggested he get a second opinion. That was hardly worth tracking me down over, unless there was something else going on. I opened my laptop and started researching. Thompson's Auto Repair had been in business for 8 years, according to the State Business Registry. Rick Thompson had a mechanic's license and no obvious criminal record. But when I dug deeper into the business filings, something interesting emerged. The shop had changed hands 3 times in the past 5 years. Each previous owner had sold after less than 2 years, and in each case, the sale had happened shortly after a spike in consumer complaints to the Better Business Bureau. Rick had bought the business 18 months ago, and the complaint pattern was already starting to repeat. I was still researching when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Rick Thompson. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. About what? The reply came back immediately. About you interfering with my customers and damaging my business. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the coffee shop on Main Street, or I start making phone calls about your background to people you probably don't want hearing from me. I read the message 3 times, my heart rate accelerating with each reading. It was clearly a threat, but I couldn't figure out what Rick thought he had on me. My background was clean. I'd never been arrested, never defaulted on a loan, never done anything that could damage my reputation or career prospects. Unless he was planning to lie. I called Jordan immediately. I think I have a problem. What kind of problem? I read her Rick's text messages. Jordan, what if he calls Margaret and tells her I'm some kind of troublemaker? What if he makes up stories about me harassing his customers or trying to sabotage his business? Alex, slow down. Margaret Rodriguez didn't build a real estate empire by believing random accusations from disgruntled shop owners. She's not going to torpedo a business partnership because some mechanic calls her with complaints. But what if he's convincing? What if he has other people backing up his story? Jordan was quiet for a moment. Okay, let's think about this logically. What does Rick Thompson actually want? He's not asking for money, and he's not threatening to sue you. He wants to meet and talk. Maybe he just wants you to stay away from his shop. Then why the threat about making phone calls? Because he's trying to intimidate you into doing what he wants without having to actually explain what that is. I looked at Rick's message again. The threat was vague enough to be meaningless but specific enough to be scary. He was fishing, trying to figure out if I had something to hide that he could use against me. What do you think I should do? I think you should meet with him, Jordan said. But not alone, and not at some coffee shop where he can control the situation. Meet him at his shop, during business hours, with witnesses around. Are you insane? I'm not going back to that place. Alex, think about it. If you meet him in public, with other people around, he can't threaten you or try to intimidate you. And if he's planning to spread lies about you, wouldn't you rather know what those lies are so you can defend yourself? I knew Jordan was right, but the thought of confronting Rick Thompson made my stomach churn. I'd spent most of my life avoiding conflict, trying to blend in and not make waves. The idea of deliberately walking into a confrontation went against every instinct I had. But Margaret's partnership offer had changed something in me. For the first time in my life, I had something worth fighting for, something that could set me up for real success and independence. I wasn't going to let Rick Thompson destroy that opportunity with threats and intimidation. I texted him back, I'll meet you at your shop tomorrow at 2 p.m. This conversation happens in front of your employees. His response was immediate, fine, but you're not going to like what I have to say. I spent most of that night lying awake, trying to imagine what Rick could possibly think he had on me. By morning, I'd convinced myself that he was bluffing, that this was just a desperate attempt to scare me away from his business. But as I drove to Thompson's Auto Repair the next afternoon, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The shop looked exactly the same as it had 3 days earlier, except now there was a different car in the second service bay, and Danny Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Rick was waiting for me in the office, standing behind the counter with his arms crossed and an expression that could have curdled milk. "You came," he said when I walked in. "I wasn't sure you would." "You said you had something to discuss." Linda was at her desk, pretending to work on paperwork but obviously listening to every word. The customer waiting area was empty except for an older woman reading a magazine, probably waiting for her car to be finished. "Yeah, I do have something to discuss," Rick said, pulling a manila folder from under the counter. "I did some research on you after our little encounter the other day. Turns out you're quite the interesting person, Alex Chen." He opened the folder and spread several papers across the counter. From where I was standing, I could see what looked like printouts of news articles, social media posts, and official documents. "You graduated from Oakwood Community College last month," Rick continued. "Business degree summa cum laude. Very impressive. You also spent 4 years working part-time at Henderson's Hardware, where you were apparently quite the employee advocate." I felt my blood turn to ice. Henderson's Hardware had been my first job during college, and I'd left under circumstances that I'd hoped would never come back to haunt me. "You see," Rick said, clearly enjoying my reaction, "I called around to some people in the business community. Asked if anyone knew anything about a young woman named Alex Chen who liked to interfere with other people's operations. And wouldn't you know it, Jim Henderson had quite a story to tell. Jim Henderson owned a small hardware store where I'd worked for 2 years, stocking shelves and helping customers. What Rick apparently didn't know was that Jim Henderson was also a notorious cheapskate who'd been systematically underpaying his employees and violating labor laws for years. "Mr. Henderson told me all about how you organized the other employees to file complaints against him," Rick continued. "How you convinced them they were being treated unfairly, got them all worked up about overtime pay and break schedules. Cost him thousands of dollars in back wages and legal fees." The woman with the magazine looked up with interest. Linda had stopped pretending to work and was listening openly now. "He also mentioned that you have a real problem with authority figures," Rick said. "That you think you know better than your bosses how to run their businesses." I found my voice. Jim Henderson was breaking the law. His employees were working 50-hour weeks without overtime pay. They had a right to file those complaints. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Rick said, his voice getting louder. "You always think you're the hero of the story. You always think you know better than people who've been in business for years. I think people deserve to be treated fairly, and I think troublemakers like you are bad for business." Rick leaned forward across the counter. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from my shop, you're going to stop interfering with my customers, and you're going to keep your mouth shut about whatever you think you know about how I run my business." "Or what?" Rick smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Or I start making phone calls. I call every business association in town and tell them about your history of harassing employers and organizing complaints against legitimate businesses. I call the Better Business Bureau and tell them you're running some kind of scam where you pretend to help customers while you're actually trying to damage established businesses." He paused, clearly enjoying the moment. "And I call Margaret Rodriguez and tell her she's about to partner with someone who has a documented history of being a disruptive influence in the local business community." The room went completely silent. Even the woman with the magazine had stopped reading and was staring at us. Linda looked like she wanted to disappear under her desk. "You researched my job interview," I said quietly. "I researched everything about you. Your interesting conversation yesterday that I wanted to discuss with you. Can you come by my office this afternoon, say around 3? My stomach dropped. "Of course. Is everything all right with the partnership?" "We'll talk when you get here," Margaret said, and ended the call without any of the warmth that had characterized our previous conversations. I spent the next 6 hours alternating between panic and rage, imagining every possible scenario for how Rick's phone call might have played out. Had he portrayed me as some kind of radical activist who went around destroying businesses for fun? Had he convinced Margaret that I was unstable, untrustworthy, or professionally dangerous? Margaret's office was located in a gleaming high-rise downtown, the kind of building where every surface was either marble or glass and the elevators moved so smoothly you barely realized you were rising 30 floors above the city. Her corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Riverside's business district, and the walls were lined with awards, certificates, and photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies for various commercial developments. "Alex, please sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing her desk. Her manner was professional but noticeably cooler than it had been during our lunch meeting. "I received a phone call yesterday from a man named Rick Thompson," she continued without preamble. "He owns an automotive repair shop on Industrial Boulevard. He had some very concerning things to say about you." I took a deep breath. "I'm sure he did. What exactly did he tell you?" "He told me that you have a history of targeting small business owners with harassment campaigns disguised as customer advocacy. He said you cost your previous employer thousands of dollars in legal fees by organizing fraudulent labor complaints. And he said you've been systematically interfering with his customers in an attempt to damage his business." Margaret paused, studying my face. "He also mentioned that you've been stalking him and his employees, taking photographs of his shop, and making threatening phone calls." The last accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That's completely false. I've never stalked anyone, never taken photographs of his shop, and never made any threatening calls." "But you did interfere with his customers?" I chose my words carefully. "I helped an elderly man understand a bill that seemed excessive. The man was being charged for services he hadn't requested and didn't need. I suggested he get a second opinion." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "And your previous employer? The labor complaints?" "My previous employer was violating federal labor laws. His employees were working overtime without compensation, and their break schedules violated state regulations. I didn't organize anything. I simply informed my coworkers about their rights under the law. According to Mr. Thompson, those complaints were ultimately dismissed as baseless." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. The complaints weren't dismissed. The Department of Labor found multiple violations and ordered my employer to pay nearly $15,000 in back wages. Jim Henderson settled rather than face additional penalties. Margaret made a note on the legal pad in front of her. "Mr. Thompson seemed very certain about the details of your employment history. Then Mr. Thompson is either misinformed or deliberately lying." The words hung in the air between us for a long moment. Margaret set down her pen and looked directly at me. "Alex, I want to believe you. Your interview was impressive, your academic record is excellent, and my instincts about people are usually sound. But Mr. Thompson was very convincing, and he had documentation to support his claims." "What kind of documentation?" "Copies of complaint forms, correspondence from your former employer, even screenshots of negative reviews that he claims you posted about his business under fake names." My blood turned to ice. "Margaret, I've never posted any reviews about Thompson's auto repair. I've never even been on their review pages. If Rick has screenshots showing otherwise, then he's fabricated them." Margaret opened a folder and slid several pages across the desk. I recognized immediately what Rick had done. The documents were real enough, but they told only part of the story. The complaint forms from Henderson's Hardware showed employee grievances about working conditions, but they didn't include the Department of Labor's findings that substantiated those complaints. The correspondence from Jim Henderson painted me as a disgruntled employee who'd caused trouble, but it didn't mention that the trouble had been exposing illegal employment practices. Most damaging were the fake review screenshots. Rick had somehow created convincing-looking images that appeared to show negative reviews of his shop posted under various names, including one that used a variation of my email address. The reviews were harsh and detailed, describing Rick as dishonest and accusing him of specific fraudulent practices. "Margaret, I swear to you, I never wrote any of these reviews. I don't know how he created these screenshots, but they're fabricated. The technical details suggest they're legitimate captures from Google and Yelp," Margaret said quietly. "The metadata, the formatting, even the timestamps all appear authentic." I stared at the fake reviews, feeling a growing sense of helplessness. Rick had clearly put significant time and effort into building a case against me, and he'd done it skillfully enough that even someone as sharp as Margaret was having doubts. "I understand this puts you in a difficult position," I said finally. "If you need to withdraw the partnership offer, I'll understand." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. "I'm not withdrawing the offer, but I am putting it on hold pending further investigation. I need to verify some of these claims independently before we move forward." "How long will that take?" "I don't know. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. I'm sorry, Alex. I know this isn't the outcome you were hoping for." I gathered my purse and stood to leave, trying to maintain what dignity I had left. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond to his accusations." "Alex," Margaret called as I reached the door. For what it's worth, my gut still says Mr. Thompson is the one who's lying. But I can't base a business partnership on gut feelings alone. I made it to the elevator before the tears started, and by the time I reached the parking garage, I was crying hard enough that I had to sit in my car for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Rick Thompson had just systematically dismantled my future with a combination of half-truths, outright lies, and fabricated evidence, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and research as I tried to figure out how to prove that Rick's evidence was fraudulent. I contacted the review platforms directly, but they couldn't provide information about account activity without a court order. I reached out to former coworkers at Henderson's Hardware, hoping they could provide testimony about the labor violations, but most of them were reluctant to get involved in what looked like a legal dispute. Jim Henderson himself was no help at all. When I called to ask him to clarify the circumstances of my departure, he was openly hostile. "I told that mechanic fellow exactly what you did to my business," Henderson said. "You cost me a fortune in legal fees and government fines, all because you couldn't mind your own business about things you didn't understand. Jim, you were violating federal labor laws. Your employees had a right to file those complaints. My employees were perfectly happy until you got them all worked up with your college ideas about workers' rights and fair treatment. I ran that business for 20 years before you showed up, and I never had a single complaint. You never had complaints because your employees didn't know they had options." Henderson's voice turned ugly. "You listen to me, Missy. You want to play activist and cause trouble for honest business owners? You better be prepared for the consequences. That Thompson fellow, he understands how to deal with troublemakers like you." The implication was clear. Rick hadn't just stumbled across information about my employment history. He'd actively sought out people who might have grievances against me, and he'd found at least one person willing to provide ammunition. I called Jordan that evening, desperate for advice and support, but the conversation didn't go the way I'd hoped. "Alex, I want to help, but I have to ask," Jordan said carefully. "Is there any possibility that some of what Rick is saying might be true?" The question felt like a betrayal. "You think I've been posting fake reviews?" "No, of course not. But the labor complaints at Henderson's Hardware, the way you handled the situation at Thompson's shop, maybe you could have been more diplomatic about things." "Diplomatic?" "Jordan, Rick Thompson was scamming an elderly man out of hundreds of dollars. Was I supposed to be diplomatic about fraud?" "I'm just saying that sometimes the way you approach these situations can come across as confrontational. Maybe if you'd spoken to Rick privately, instead of challenging him in front of customers and employees." I felt something cold settle in my chest. So this is my fault for not being more tactful with a con artist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that maybe there's a way to handle these situations that doesn't make you look like you're targeting businesses. Jordan meant well, but her words hit me like a slap. Even my closest friend was starting to question whether I'd brought this situation on myself by being too aggressive, too confrontational, too unwilling to compromise with people who were clearly in the wrong. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Jordan promising to help however she could but clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. I hung up feeling more isolated than I had since the whole mess started. Over the next week, the isolation only deepened. Margaret's investigation into Rick's claims was taking longer than expected, and in the meantime, word was somehow spreading through Riverside's business community that I was involved in some kind of controversy. I started noticing changes in how people responded to me during networking events and professional meetings. Conversations that would normally flow easily became stilted and awkward. People who'd previously been friendly and welcoming suddenly seemed cautious around me. The breaking point came during a small business development center workshop I'd been looking forward to for weeks. The session was about financing options for new ventures, and I'd hoped to make connections with other entrepreneurs who might be facing similar challenges. Instead, I found myself sitting alone during the break, while other attendees clustered together in animated discussions. When I tried to join a conversation about local business trends, the group gradually dispersed until I was standing by myself near the coffee table. "Excuse me, are you Alex Chen?" I turned to find a middle-aged man in a navy suit looking at me with barely concealed hostility. "Yes, I am. I'm Bill Morrison from Morrison Insurance. I heard you've been causing problems for some of our local business owners." My heart sank. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I heard you've been harassing auto repair shops, filing false complaints, trying to damage legitimate businesses with fake reviews." Morrison's voice was loud enough that several other people turned to listen. "Is that true? No, absolutely not. I helped one customer understand his bill, and I've never posted any fake reviews about anyone." Morrison looked skeptical. "That's not what I heard. I heard you have a history of targeting small business owners with frivolous lawsuits and regulatory complaints." I could feel the weight of other people's attention, could sense them forming opinions about me based on Morrison's accusations. "Whoever told you that is lying." "So Rick Thompson is lying? Jim Henderson is lying? Multiple business owners are all conspiring against you for no reason?" The question was posed loudly enough that everyone in the room could hear it, and I realized this wasn't a private confrontation. This was a public character assassination, and I was powerless to stop it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you'd like to discuss this privately." "I think we've heard enough," Morrison interrupted. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd be very careful about doing business with this woman. She's got a documented history of causing trouble for honest business owners." I looked around the room, seeing suspicion and judgment in every face. These were people I'd hoped to build professional relationships with. Potential partners and collaborators who might have helped me establish myself in Riverside's business community. Instead, they were looking at me like I was some kind of predator who'd infiltrated their professional network. I gathered my materials and left without saying another word. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and finally understood the full scope of what Rick Thompson had done to me. He hadn't just threatened my partnership with Margaret Rodriguez. He'd systematically poisoned my reputation throughout the local business community, turning me into a pariah before I'd even had a chance to establish myself professionally. That night, I seriously considered leaving Riverside entirely. I could transfer my credits to a school in another city, start over somewhere that Rick Thompson's influence couldn't reach. I spent hours researching graduate programs in other states, looking at job markets in cities where nobody had ever heard of Thompson's auto repair or Alex Chen's supposed history of business harassment. But every time I started filling out an application or researching apartment rentals, I thought about Carlos Martinez and the relief in his eyes when someone finally stood up for him. I thought about Danny Thompson, who'd risked his brother's anger to tell the truth about a customer's car. I thought about all the other customers who'd left negative reviews about Rick's shop, people who'd been overcharged and intimidated and dismissed because they seemed vulnerable. Running away would mean letting Rick win. It would mean abandoning every principle I'd developed about standing up for what was right, even when the cost was high. But staying meant continuing to fight a battle I wasn't sure I could win, against an opponent who was clearly more ruthless and better connected than I'd realized. The decision was made for me Thursday morning when I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a simple message typed in block letters: "Last warning. Leave town OR. Everyone will know what you really are." There was no signature, but the message was clear enough. Rick Thompson was escalating from professional sabotage to outright intimidation, and he apparently felt confident enough in his position to make direct threats. I photographed the note and took it to the police, but the desk sergeant wasn't encouraging about my prospects for getting any help. "Ma'am, this could have come from anyone," he said, barely glancing at the paper. "Unless you have evidence that this specific person sent it, there's not much we can do. And even if we could prove who sent it, Threatening to damage someone's reputation isn't technically a crime. What about harassment? Stalking? Has anyone followed you or tried to contact you directly against your wishes? I thought about Rick's text messages and our confrontation at his shop, but those interactions had been initiated by mutual agreement. Not exactly. Then there's no crime here. My advice would be to avoid contact with whoever you think is behind this and document anything else that happens. I left the police station feeling more hopeless than ever. Rick could apparently say whatever he wanted about me to whoever would listen, and there was no legal recourse available. He could spread lies about my professional history, fabricate evidence of misconduct, and even send anonymous threats, all without facing any consequences. That afternoon, Margaret Rodriguez called with the news I'd been dreading. "Alex, I've completed my investigation into Mr. Thompson's claims," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "While I wasn't able to definitively prove or disprove everything he alleged, there's enough ambiguity that I can't move forward with the partnership at this time." "I understand," I said, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. "I want you to know that this decision isn't based on any conclusion about your character or your capabilities. It's purely a business decision based on risk assessment. Of course, if circumstances change, if you're able to provide additional documentation that clarifies some of these issues, I'd be open to reconsidering in the future. Thank you for giving me that much consideration." After Margaret hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the partnership documents she'd given me the week before. The financial projections, the architectural drawings, the comprehensive business plan for an automotive center that would have revolutionized customer service in Riverside's industrial corridor. All of it was now just expensive paper, worthless reminders of an opportunity that Rick Thompson had systematically destroyed. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "Heard about Margaret, I'm sorry. Want to grab dinner and talk?" I turned off the phone without responding. Jordan meant well, but I wasn't ready to hear another lecture about diplomacy and the importance of not making enemies in the business community. I wasn't ready to pretend that this was somehow a learning experience or an opportunity for personal growth. The truth was, I'd done everything right. I'd worked hard, graduated with honors, developed a solid business plan, and impressed a successful entrepreneur enough that she'd offered me a partnership. I'd helped a customer avoid being scammed, stood up for workers' rights, and tried to compete honestly in a marketplace that desperately needed more honesty. And none of that mattered because Rick Thompson was better at playing dirty than I was at playing fair. I spent the weekend avoiding phone calls and emails, ignoring the growing pile of bills on my kitchen table, and researching one-way bus tickets to cities where nobody had ever heard of Thompson's auto repair. By Sunday night, I'd narrowed it down to 3 options. Seattle, where the tech boom might provide opportunities for someone with my background. Austin, where the startup culture might be more forgiving of controversy. Or Denver, where a friend from college had mentioned job openings at a consulting firm. Monday morning brought another envelope under my door, this one containing photocopies of what appeared to be police reports and court documents. The pages were heavily redacted, but the visible portions suggested arrests for disorderly conduct, trespassing, and harassment of business owners. My name appeared to be mentioned in several places, though the redactions made it impossible to read the full context. I knew immediately that the documents were fabricated, just like the fake reviews Rick had shown Margaret. But they were convincing enough that anyone who wanted to believe the worst about me would find them compelling. Rick was apparently building an entire false criminal history to go along with the false professional history he'd already created. That's when I realized that leaving town wouldn't solve the problem. Rick had clearly invested significant time and resources into destroying my reputation, and there was nothing to stop him from following me to a new city and spreading the same lies there. Digital information travels faster than people do, and in the age of social media and online background checks, there's no such thing as truly starting over. If I was going to fight this, I had to do it here and now, while the lies were still fresh, and before they had time to spread beyond Riverside's business community. But fighting back would require resources I didn't have, allies I'd already lost, and a level of strategic thinking that I wasn't sure I possessed. Tuesday morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of buying a bus ticket or filling out job applications in other cities, I drove to the Riverside Public Library and spent 6 hours researching everything I could find about Rick Thompson, his business, and his connections in the local community. What I discovered was that Rick's campaign against me wasn't just personal vindictiveness. It was a defensive strategy designed to protect a business model that was fundamentally fraudulent. The fake reviews, the manufactured evidence, the systematic character assassination were all part of a pattern that suggested Rick had dealt with whistleblowers before. More importantly, I found evidence that Rick's reach in the business community wasn't as extensive as he'd led me to believe. Most of the people who'd been spreading rumors about me had gotten their information secondhand, from a small network of business owners who were either friends with Rick or had their own reasons for discouraging scrutiny of questionable business practices. The revelation gave me something I'd been lacking for the past 2 weeks: hope. Rick Thompson wasn't an all-powerful community leader with unlimited influence. He was a small-time con artist who'd gotten lucky with his timing and his targets. And like most con artists, his power depended on his victims' willingness to stay silent and accept defeat. I wasn't ready to accept defeat anymore. That evening, I started making phone calls. Not to potential employers in other cities, but to the customers who'd left negative reviews about Thompson's auto repair. If Rick was going to make this a war, then I was going to start building an army. The first customer I called was a woman named Patricia Williams, who'd left a scathing review about Thompson's auto repair 6 months earlier. According to her post, Rick had charged her $800 for a brake job that another shop later said was completely unnecessary. When I reached her Tuesday evening, Patricia's voice immediately turned wary. "Who is this again? And why are you asking about that terrible auto shop?" I explained who I was and what had happened, being careful not to reveal too many details about my situation with Margaret Rodriguez. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a long sigh. "Honey, that man is a predator." He took one look at me, a 60-year-old woman driving alone in an older car, and decided I was easy money. When I tried to question the charges, he got aggressive and started talking about how dangerous it was for women my age to drive around with faulty brakes. "Did you report it anywhere besides the online review?" "I called the Better Business Bureau, but they said it was my word against his. I called my bank to dispute the charge, but by then it had been too long." Patricia paused. "I also called that insurance agent, Bill Morrison, because he'd been the one who recommended Thompson's shop to me in the first place." My pulse quickened. "Bill Morrison recommended Thompson's to you?" "Oh yes, when I mentioned needing a mechanic, he went on and on about what an honest, reliable business Rick ran. Said he'd been sending customers there for years and never had a single complaint." This was the first concrete connection I'd found between Rick and the broader business community. Bill Morrison had been the one who'd publicly confronted me at the business development workshop, and now I learned he'd been actively referring customers to Thompson's auto repair. "Patricia, would you be willing to speak to someone official about your experience? Maybe testify if there was an investigation." "Depends on what kind of investigation." "I'm retired, honey. I don't need the stress of lawyers and courtrooms." "I understand. Can I ask you something else? Have you heard anyone in the business community talking about a woman named Alex Chen? Someone who supposedly harasses auto repair shops?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Now that you mention it, Bill Morrison did say something a few weeks ago about some troublemaker who'd been going around trying to damage Rick's business with false accusations. He warned me to be careful if anyone contacted me about Thompson's shop." The pieces were starting to come together. Rick hadn't just fabricated evidence against me. He'd proactively reached out to his victims to warn them that I might contact them. He was trying to control the narrative before I even knew there was a story to tell. I spent the next 3 hours calling every customer who'd left a negative review about Thompson's auto repair. The pattern that emerged was both clear and disturbing. Rick systematically targeted customers who appeared vulnerable: elderly drivers, young women, people driving older cars, anyone who seemed unlikely to challenge his authority or seek second opinions. More troubling was the discovery that several of the negative reviews had mysteriously disappeared from Google and Yelp over the past few months. When I asked customers about this, most said they'd received emails from the platforms claiming their reviews violated community guidelines, but none could explain why their honest accounts of poor service would be considered inappropriate. Sarah Martinez, a teacher who'd been charged $600 for an oil change that supposedly revealed multiple engine problems, told me her review had been removed 3 times. Every time I reposted it, within a week it would be gone again. The platform kept saying I was posting false information, but everything I wrote was exactly what happened. Did you keep any documentation? Receipts, estimates, anything from other shops that contradicted what Thompson told you? I have everything. Receipts, photos, even a written estimate from another mechanic who said my engine was fine and that Thompson had basically made up every problem he claimed to find. Sarah was the 3rd customer who mentioned having documentation that directly contradicted Rick's diagnoses. If I could gather enough of these cases together, I might be able to establish a pattern of fraud that even Rick's political connections couldn't cover up. By Thursday, I'd spoken with 12 former Thompson customers, and 11 of them had stories that followed the same basic script. Rick would identify some expensive problem that required immediate attention, pressure the customer into authorizing repairs they couldn't afford to refuse, then deliver substandard work at premium prices. The few customers who'd sought second opinions had universally been told that the urgent repairs Rick had recommended were either unnecessary or had been performed incorrectly. But the most important discovery came from my conversation with David Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname. David was a local business owner who'd been charged $1,500 for transmission work that had actually made his truck run worse than before he'd brought it to Thompson's. I was so angry I hired a lawyer, David told me. We were getting ready to file a lawsuit when suddenly Rick offered to refund the entire amount, plus an additional $1,000 to cover my legal fees. He settled out of court? Not just settled. He made me sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from talking about my experience or posting any negative reviews. He said if I violated the NDA, I'd have to pay back the settlement plus damages. This was the breakthrough I'd been looking for. Rick Thompson wasn't just overcharging customers. He was systematically silencing anyone who tried to expose his practices. The disappeared online reviews, the reluctance of some customers to talk, even the difficulty I'd had finding people willing to speak publicly about their experiences, all made sense now. David, are you still bound by that NDA? Technically, yes, but the lawyer I hired said the agreement might not be enforceable if Rick was engaged in criminal fraud. The problem is proving the fraud part. What if I told you I might have found a way to do exactly that? Friday morning, I drove to the Riverside County Clerk's office and spent 4 hours digging through business licenses, property records, and civil court filings. What I found painted a picture of Rick Thompson as a serial entrepreneur who'd left a trail of failed businesses and unhappy customers across 3 different counties. Thompson's Auto Repair was actually Rick's 4th automotive business in 5 years. Each previous venture had closed under suspicious circumstances, usually after a sudden spike in customer complaints and regulatory scrutiny. Rick had a pattern of operating a shop for 18 to 24 months, milking it for maximum profit through questionable practices, then closing down and reopening elsewhere under a slightly different business name. More importantly, I discovered that Rick didn't own the building that housed Thompson's Auto Repair. He was renting the space from Rodriguez Properties LLC, which meant he was Margaret Rodriguez's tenant. His lease was indeed up for renewal in 6 weeks, just as I'd suspected. But the real revelation came when I cross-referenced the property records with the business license applications. Rick had listed Bill Morrison as a personal reference on 3 separate applications, and Morrison's insurance agency was listed as the commercial insurance provider for 2 of Rick's previous businesses. The relationship between Rick Thompson and Bill Morrison wasn't casual. They were business partners, or at least close enough collaborators that Morrison had a financial interest in Rick's success. That explained why Morrison had been so quick to defend Rick at the business development workshop, and why he'd been actively referring customers to Thompson's shop despite its terrible reputation. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to have another conversation with Margaret Rodriguez. But this time, I wasn't going to approach her as a supplicant hoping for mercy. I was going to approach her as someone who had valuable information about one of her tenants. Margaret agreed to meet me Saturday morning at her office. though her tone on the phone suggested she was reluctant to reopen a conversation she considered closed. When I arrived, she was already seated behind her desk with a stack of paperwork that suggested she'd rather be doing anything else than dealing with my ongoing drama. "Alex, I appreciate your persistence, but I thought I made my position clear. The partnership opportunity is no longer available. I understand that, and I'm not here to ask you to reconsider. I'm here to share some information about Rick Thompson that you might find relevant as his landlord." Margaret's expression shifted slightly. "What kind of information?" I spread the documents I'd gathered across her desk. Business license applications, court filings, customer testimonials, and financial records that painted a clear picture of fraudulent business practices. Rick Thompson has been systematically defrauding customers for years. He targets vulnerable people, overcharges for unnecessary work, and then silences anyone who tries to complain through intimidation and legal threats. Margaret examined the papers carefully, her business instincts clearly engaged, despite her personal reservations about me. "These are serious allegations, Alex. Do you have proof that would hold up in court?" "I have documentation from multiple customers who were overcharged, receipts showing inflated prices for parts and labor, and evidence that Rick has been manipulating online reviews to hide negative feedback." I pulled out the folder containing testimonies from the customers I'd interviewed. "I also have signed statements from 11 former customers who are willing to testify about their experiences." "And you gathered all this information because?" "Because Rick Thompson destroyed my professional reputation with fabricated evidence, and I decided to fight back with real evidence." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the calculating look of someone evaluating a business proposition. "Alex, assuming everything you're telling me is true, what exactly do you want me to do with this information? I want you to understand that Rick Thompson is using your property to run a fraudulent business that's damaging your reputation as a landlord. Every customer he cheats, every elderly person he intimidates, every young woman he overcharges, reflects poorly on you as the property owner who enables his operation. That's a fair point, but Rick's lease doesn't expire for another 6 weeks, and I can't evict a tenant without proper legal grounds. Actually, you can." I pulled out a copy of Rick's lease agreement, which I'd obtained through a public records request. Section 12 of his lease agreement specifically prohibits using the premises for any illegal activities. Systematic fraud definitely qualifies. Margaret read through the relevant section of the lease, her eyebrows rising slightly as she absorbed the implications. "You've done your homework. I've had plenty of motivation. Margaret, Rick Thompson didn't just attack my professional reputation. He fabricated evidence, manipulated review platforms, and enlisted his business partners to spread lies about me throughout the local business community. He did all of this to protect a criminal enterprise that's been operating out of your building for 18 months. His business partners?" I showed her the documentation connecting Bill Morrison to Rick's operation. Morrison has been referring customers to Thompson's shop and actively defending Rick against criticism. He's financially invested in keeping Rick's operation running smoothly. Margaret studied the papers for several minutes, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed completely. "Alex, if even half of what you're telling me is accurate, then I have a serious problem on my hands. Not just with Rick Thompson, but potentially with my insurance company, my business license, and my professional reputation." "That's exactly right. Rick Thompson is a liability that's getting bigger every day he remains your tenant. The question is what to do about it. Even with this evidence, breaking a commercial lease isn't simple. Rick could fight the eviction, tie it up in court for months, maybe even sue me for damages. What if you didn't have to evict him? What if he decided to leave on his own?" Margaret tilted her head. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Rick Thompson's business model depends on operating in the shadows, preying on customers who don't know they have options. What happens when those customers suddenly have an alternative?" I pulled out the final folder I'd brought, the business plan for the automotive center that Margaret and I had originally discussed. "Your partnership offer might be off the table, but the market opportunity is still there. In fact, it's bigger than we originally thought. Because now we know exactly how much demand there is for honest automotive service in this area. Margaret examined the updated business plan, which I'd revised to incorporate everything I'd learned about Rick's operation and the gaps in the local market. Alex, this is impressive work. But even if I were willing to move forward with the automotive center, it doesn't solve the immediate problem of Rick Thompson's lease. Actually, it does. Rick's lease includes a clause about competing businesses operating within a certain radius of his shop. If you develop a new automotive center on your property 2 blocks away, he can claim that violates his exclusive service territory agreement. Margaret flipped through Rick's lease until she found the relevant clause. This gives him grounds to break his lease without penalty. Exactly. He gets to leave without admitting wrongdoing, you get to remove a problematic tenant without a messy eviction process, and the community gets access to honest automotive service. And you get your reputation back? I nodded. Rick's entire case against me falls apart once it becomes clear that his accusations were motivated by a desire to protect his fraudulent business. Every lie he told about me becomes evidence of his own criminal intent. Margaret closed the folders and looked directly at me. Alex, I have to ask. Why should I trust you after everything that's happened? How do I know this isn't just an elaborate revenge scheme? The question was fair, and I'd been preparing for it. Margaret, everything I've shown you can be independently verified. The customer testimonials, the business records, the lease violations. None of it depends on taking my word for anything. You can have your own investigators confirm every detail, and if I do that and it all checks out, then we move forward with the Automotive Center project. Not as a favor to me, but as a sound business decision that protects your interests and serves the community. Margaret gathered the documents and stood up. I'll need a few days to review everything and conduct my own investigation. If your information proves accurate, we'll schedule another meeting to discuss terms. What kind of terms? The same partnership structure we originally discussed, but with one modification. You'll be responsible for managing the transition away from Rick Thompson's operation and ensuring that his former customers know they have better options available. I felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Don't get ahead of yourself, Alex. I still need to verify your claims independently. But I will say this. If Rick Thompson really has been running a fraudulent operation out of my building, then he picked the wrong landlord to mess with. That afternoon, I drove to Carlos Martinez's restaurant for the first time since the day I'd helped him at Thompson's Auto Repair. The lunch crowd was just finishing up, and Carlos was behind the counter settling bills and chatting with regular customers. When he saw me walk in, his face broke into a wide smile. Alex, I was wondering when you'd come by. How have you been? I looked around the cozy restaurant, taking in the family photos on the walls, the smell of authentic Mexican cooking, and the warm atmosphere that Carlos had clearly spent years building. I've been better, Carlos. Actually, I was hoping I could talk to you about something. Carlos led me to a quiet table in the corner and brought over 2 cups of coffee without being asked. You look troubled, Micha. What's going on? I told him everything that had happened since our encounter at Thompson's shop, starting with Rick's research into my background and ending with my meeting with Margaret Rodriguez that morning. Carlos listened intently, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath in Spanish. That pendejo thinks he can intimidate anyone who stands up to him, Carlos said when I finished. But he made a mistake targeting you. What do you mean? I mean, you're not some scared customer who's going to take his abuse and slink away. You're a fighter, and you're smart enough to know how to fight effectively. Carlos reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. You remember I told you I've been in business for 30 years? Well, in that time, I've learned who the honest people are in this community, and who the snakes are. Rick Thompson is definitely a snake, but so is Bill Morrison. You know about their connection? Maija, Morrison's been running the same scam for years. He sells insurance to small business owners, then refers them to shops like Thompson's for overpriced repairs. He gets kickbacks from the repair shops, and the business owners get stuck with inflated bills they can't dispute because Morrison vouches for the quality of the work. This was an angle I hadn't considered. Carlos, would you be willing to document what you know about Morrison's operation? I'll do better than that. I'll introduce you to some other business owners who've been burned by the same scheme. Morrison targeted Latino business owners especially, figuring we'd be less likely to complain or report problems to authorities. Carlos made several phone calls in rapid Spanish, and within an hour, 3 other business owners had joined us at the restaurant. Each had a similar story. Morrison had sold them commercial insurance, then recommended Thompson's shop for vehicle maintenance. Each had been overcharged for unnecessary repairs, and each had been discouraged from filing complaints by Morrison's warnings about the importance of maintaining good relationships with service providers. "The thing is," said Maria Santos, who owned a cleaning service, "Morrison made it clear that our insurance rates could go up if we were seen as quote, difficult customers who caused problems for his business partners." "That's extortion," I said. "Sigh, but how do you prove it? Morrison's smart. He never puts anything in writing. And he's careful about how he phrases his threats." By the end of the afternoon, I had documented testimony from 4 business owners who'd been systematically victimized by the Morrison-Thompson partnership. More importantly, I had the beginning of a coalition of people who were willing to speak publicly about their experiences. That evening, I called Jordan for the first time since our awkward conversation the week before. "Alex, I'm so glad you called. I've been feeling terrible about how our last conversation went. Jordan, I need to tell you what I've discovered about Rick Thompson and his operation." I spent an hour bringing Jordan up to speed on everything I'd learned about the fraud ring, the fabricated evidence against me, and Margaret Rodriguez's willingness to reconsider the partnership if my information proved accurate. "Alex, this is incredible. You've basically uncovered a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for years. The question is what to do about it. I have enough evidence to expose Rick and Morrison, but I need to be strategic about how I present it. If I just start making accusations, they'll claim I'm exactly the kind of troublemaker they said I was." Jordan was quiet for a moment. "What if you didn't make the accusations yourself? What if you let the evidence speak for itself?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you organized a public forum where Rick's victims could tell their own stories? Something like a community meeting where people could share their experiences with local automotive services?" The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of positioning myself as Rick's accuser, I could create a platform for his victims to speak for themselves. It would be harder for Rick and Morrison to dismiss multiple independent testimonies than it would be to discredit a single adversary. "Jordan? That's perfect. A community forum on consumer protection, focused on automotive services. We could invite local business leaders, community organizations, maybe even city council members. And if Rick Thompson's name happens to come up repeatedly as an example of poor service practices, well, that's just what the community is experiencing." I spent the rest of the weekend planning what would eventually become the Riverside Consumer Protection Forum. The event would be held at the community center downtown, with an open microphone for anyone who wanted to share their experiences with local businesses. I'd provide information about consumer rights, resources for filing complaints, and guidance on how to recognize predatory business practices. But most importantly, I'd give Rick Thompson's victims a chance to tell their stories in front of an audience that included the very business leaders who'd been spreading rumors about my character. By Sunday night, I had a comprehensive plan for exposing Rick's operation while simultaneously rehabilitating my own reputation. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was still a chance that Rick would find a way to sabotage the forum before it could take place. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I was the one controlling the narrative instead of reacting to someone else's lies. Rick Thompson had started this war by underestimating me, and he was about to learn exactly how much that mistake was going to cost him. The Riverside Community Center had never hosted anything quite like the Consumer Protection Forum I'd organized for that Tuesday evening. 2 weeks of careful planning had resulted in an event that looked deceptively simple. Folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, a microphone stand in the center, and informational tables around the perimeter, staffed by representatives from the Better Business Bureau, the State Attorney General's office, and several local consumer advocacy groups. What wasn't immediately obvious was how strategically I'd planned every detail. The seating arrangement ensured that anyone speaking at the microphone would be facing the section where I'd encouraged local business leaders to sit. The informational materials included detailed guides on recognizing predatory business practices, with examples that closely matched Rick Thompson's methods without mentioning him by name. Most importantly, I'd spent days reaching out to every victim of Thompson's auto repair I could find, carefully coaching them on how to share their experiences effectively. Margaret Rodriguez arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled start time, taking a seat in the third row alongside City Councilwoman Janet Morrison, Chamber of Commerce President David Kim, and 2 local newspaper reporters I'd contacted about covering the event. Margaret caught my eye and nodded slightly, which I took as confirmation that her independent investigation had corroborated my claims about Rick's operation. Bill Morrison walked in just as I was adjusting the microphone, his face a mask of professional politeness that didn't quite hide his underlying tension. He'd obviously heard about the forum through business community channels and decided he needed to monitor the situation personally. What he didn't know was that Carlos Martinez had quietly spread word about Morrison's insurance kickback scheme throughout the Latino business community, and several of his victims were planning to speak tonight. Rick Thompson himself didn't appear until 5 minutes after the official start time, slipping through the back door and choosing a seat in the last row where he probably thought he could observe without being noticed. His presence sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room as people recognized him and began whispering to their neighbors. I opened the forum with a brief presentation about consumer rights and the importance of community vigilance in preventing predatory business practices. I kept my remarks general and educational, focusing on red flags that consumers should watch for, rather than making specific accusations against any local businesses. Tonight's forum exists because many of you have contacted me with concerns about your experiences with various service providers, I said, scanning the audience to make eye contact with the victims I'd interviewed. Rather than speak for you, I want to give you the opportunity to share your own stories and help others learn from your experiences. The first person to approach the microphone was Patricia Williams, the retired teacher who'd been charged $800 for unnecessary break work. Patricia had initially been reluctant to speak publicly, but after learning that several other women had similar experiences, she decided her story needed to be heard. My name is Patricia Williams, and 6 months ago I took my car to Thompson's Auto Repair for what I thought would be a routine brake inspection. Patricia began, her voice steady despite the nervousness evident in her posture. The owner, Rick Thompson, told me my brakes were dangerously worn and that I needed immediate repairs costing $800. When I asked if I could get a second opinion, he became aggressive and told me I'd be putting other drivers at risk if I left without fixing the problem. Patricia paused, glancing toward the back of the room where Rick was sitting. I was scared, so I authorized the work. But something didn't feel right, so I took my car to another shop the next week. The mechanic there told me my brakes were in excellent condition, and that most of the parts Thompson claimed to have replaced were actually original equipment that showed no signs of wear. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Patricia returned to her seat. I noticed several people taking notes, including the newspaper reporters and someone who appeared to be from the district attorney's office. The second speaker was David Chen, the business owner who'd hired a lawyer to fight Thompson's fraudulent charges. David had been hesitant to violate his non-disclosure agreement, but his attorney had confirmed that the NDA wouldn't be enforceable if Rick had committed criminal fraud. I want to talk about what happens when you try to fight back against dishonest business practices, David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned difficult lessons. Last year, Thompson's Auto Repair charged me $1,500 for transmission work that actually made my truck run worse than before. When I threatened to sue, they offered to settle for more than I'd originally paid, but only if I signed an agreement preventing me from telling anyone about my experience. David pulled out a folder and held it up. I have documentation showing that Thompson's Auto Repair has used these silencing agreements at least 6 times in the past 2 years. They systematically overcharge customers, then pay to cover up their mistakes when someone fights back. That's not customer service. That's obstruction of justice. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I saw him whisper something to the person sitting next to him. Bill Morrison was checking his phone repeatedly, his face growing paler with each speaker. Sarah Martinez, the teacher who'd been charged $600 for an oil change, approached the microphone with a thick folder of documentation. She'd clearly prepared extensively for this moment. I want to show everyone exactly how automotive fraud works, Sarah said, opening her folder. 6 months ago, I took my car to Thompson's Auto Repair for an oil change. Within an hour, I was told my engine was on the verge of catastrophic failure and needed $600 worth of immediate repairs. Sarah held up a series of photographs. These are pictures of my engine taken by Thompson's shop, supposedly showing severe damage that required urgent attention. But notice the timestamp on the photos shows they were taken 3 days before I brought my car in for service. The audience erupted in shocked whispers. Someone called out, "How is that possible?" "It's possible because these photos weren't taken of my engine at all," Sarah continued. Thompson's shop keeps a collection of photos showing damaged engines, and they use them to scare customers into authorizing unnecessary repairs. I only discovered this when I demanded copies of all documentation related to my service. Sarah held up another set of papers. I also have a written estimate from another shop stating that my engine was in excellent condition, and that the problems Thompson claimed to find simply didn't exist. The second shop refused to take any money for their inspection because they said the fraud was so obvious that exposing it was a public service. By this point, Rick Thompson was no longer trying to hide his agitation. He stood up and started moving toward the exit, but his path was blocked by Carlos Martinez, who had positioned himself strategically near the back door. "Before anyone leaves," Carlos said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "I think people should know that this problem extends beyond just automotive repair. Some insurance agents in our community have been directing customers to dishonest shops and taking kickbacks for those referrals." Bill Morrison went rigid in his seat as Carlos continued. For example, Morrison Insurance has been referring Latino business owners to Thompson's Auto Repair for years, then discouraging those customers from filing complaints by threatening to raise their insurance rates. This isn't customer service. This is systematic exploitation of people who trust their insurance agent to look out for their interests. Maria Santos, who owned the cleaning service, stood up from her seat without approaching the microphone. "Carlos is right. Bill Morrison sold me commercial insurance, then sent me to Thompson's shop when my van needed service. When I complained about being overcharged, Morrison told me that making a fuss could affect my insurance eligibility." 2 other business owners stood up and nodded their agreement. The pattern was becoming undeniably clear, and Bill Morrison was trapped in his seat by the weight of multiple accusations from credible witnesses. Margaret Rodriguez rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room. As one of the most respected business leaders in Riverside, her decision to speak carried enormous weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Alex Chen for organizing this forum and giving our community a chance to address these serious concerns," Margaret began. "As someone who owns commercial property throughout Riverside, I have a responsibility to ensure that my tenants operate honest, ethical businesses that serve our community well." Margaret turned to look directly at Rick Thompson. "Based on what I've heard tonight and my own independent investigation into Thompson's Auto Repair, I can confirm that this business has been systematically defrauding customers while operating out of property I own. Effective immediately, I am terminating Thompson's lease for violations of both the rental agreement and basic standards of business conduct." The room exploded into applause. Rick Thompson pushed past Carlos and stormed out of the building, but not before shouting something about lawsuits and false accusations. His dramatic exit only reinforced the impression that he was exactly the kind of person the speakers had described. Margaret wasn't finished. "I also want to announce that Rodriguez Properties will be developing a new automotive service center that will set the gold standard for honest, transparent customer service in our community. This facility will feature certified technicians, upfront pricing, and a customer bill of rights that ensures everyone receives fair treatment, regardless of what they drive or how much money they appear to have." She paused and looked directly at me. "I'm pleased to announce that this new automotive center will be managed by Alex Chen, whose dedication to consumer protection and business ethics makes her the ideal person to lead this initiative." The applause was even louder this time, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes as weeks of stress and humiliation finally gave way to vindication and hope. But the evening wasn't over yet. Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Riverside Police Department, who had been quietly observing from the side of the room, stepped forward to address the audience. I want to thank everyone who spoke tonight for bringing these matters to our attention, Detective Rodriguez said. Based on the testimony we've heard and the documentation that's been provided, the police department will be opening a formal investigation into Thompson's auto repair and any associated businesses. She looked toward the section where Bill Morrison was sitting, though he seemed to be trying to make himself invisible in his chair. We'll also be investigating allegations of insurance fraud and consumer protection violations that may involve other local businesses. Anyone who has additional information or documentation related to these matters should contact our department immediately. Detective Rodriguez handed me a business card. Ms. Chen will need to schedule a formal interview to document everything you've learned about this operation. Your investigation has provided exactly the kind of evidence we need to pursue criminal charges. As the formal portion of the forum concluded, people began clustering around the informational tables to speak with representatives from various consumer protection agencies. Several victims of Thompson's shop were signing formal complaints, while others were getting advice about recovering money they'd lost to fraudulent charges. Carlos Martinez approached me with a wide smile and a warm handshake. Misha, you did something amazing tonight, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been hurt by these thieves. I couldn't have done it without people like you willing to speak up, I replied. You and the others who testified tonight are the real heroes. No, Alex, you're the one who turned individual problems into community action. That takes courage and intelligence that most people don't have. Margaret Rodriguez joined our conversation, carrying a briefcase that I suspected contained new partnership documents. Alex, do you have time to stop by my office tomorrow morning? I'd like to finalize the details of our automotive center project and discuss the timeline for getting construction started. Of course. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Well, since Thompson's lease termination is effective immediately, we can begin construction on the new facility within 2 weeks. I'm thinking we could have the doors open within 3 months if we push the contractors. Margaret paused and lowered her voice. I also owe you an apology. I should have investigated Thompson's claims more thoroughly before putting our partnership on hold. The evidence you presented was solid, and I should have recognized that someone willing to fabricate that much documentation was probably lying about everything else too. You were protecting your business interests, I said. I understand why you had to be cautious. I was protecting my business interests, but I was also allowing myself to be intimidated by Morrison and his network of supporters. Tonight showed me that standing up to bullies is always the right choice, even when it's not the easy choice. Jordan Kim appeared at my elbow, having arrived just in time to witness the evening's dramatic conclusion. Alex, I am so proud of you I could burst, Jordan said, wrapping me in a fierce hug. You didn't just clear your name tonight, you exposed a criminal conspiracy and probably saved dozens of future victims from being scammed. It's not over yet, I replied. Rick and Morrison are still out there, and they're probably planning their next move right now. Let them plan, said Detective Rodriguez, who had been listening to our conversation. After tonight, they're on our radar, and we have enough evidence to make their lives very difficult if they try to continue their operation anywhere in this county. As people began filing out of the community center, I noticed Bill Morrison slipping out through a side exit, clearly hoping to avoid any more public attention. His insurance business would probably survive the scandal, but his reputation as a community leader was finished. Rick Thompson's story would end differently. Within a week, the police investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud dating back to his previous businesses in other counties. The fabricated evidence he'd used against me turned out to be part of a larger pattern of document manipulation that included falsified repair estimates, backdated photographs, and forged customer signatures. More importantly, investigators discovered that Rick had been operating without proper licensing for several types of repairs he'd been performing. The state revoked his mechanic's license and imposed fines that effectively ended his career in automotive service. The non-disclosure agreements Rick had used to silence previous victims were ruled unenforceable due to their connection to criminal activity. David Chen and several other customers were free to pursue civil lawsuits for the money they'd lost, and most chose to do exactly that. 3 weeks after the Consumer Protection Forum, I stood in the empty building that had housed Thompson's Auto Repair. planning the layout for what would become Riverside's first customer-focused automotive service center. Margaret had given me complete authority over the design and operations, and I was determined to create something that would set new standards for the industry. The customer waiting area would feature comfortable seating, free Wi-Fi, watching you open this business, and knowing how many people you're going to help. I want you to know that I was right about you. Carlos paused, his voice becoming emotional. My daughter died in a car accident 5 years ago. She was driving an old car that broke down on the freeway because a dishonest mechanic had talked her out of repairs she couldn't afford. If she'd had access to a shop like this one, she might still be alive today. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as Carlos continued. You didn't just expose Rick Thompson's fraud. You probably saved lives by giving people access to honest automotive service. That's something to be proud of for the rest of your life. As the reception wound down and the last customers toured the new facility, I stood in the customer service area that had been the heart of my vision for the business. The walls were lined with customer testimonials, photos from the grand opening, and framed copies of the Consumer Protection Awards we'd received. But what made me proudest were the smaller details that reflected our commitment to treating every customer with dignity and respect. The comfortable seating that accommodated people of all ages and physical abilities. The multilingual signage that welcomed Spanish-speaking customers. The clear pricing displays that eliminated any guesswork about service costs. Most importantly, there was a framed copy of the Customer Bill of Rights that we'd developed, guaranteeing honest communication, fair pricing, and respectful treatment for everyone who walked through our doors. It was everything that Rick Thompson's operation had refused to provide, and everything that I wished had been available when I'd first encountered him with my broken-down Honda. Margaret joined me as I was reviewing the day's sales figures, which exceeded our most optimistic projections. Alex, I have to ask you something. Do you ever regret what happened with Rick Thompson? If he hadn't tried to destroy your reputation, you might have ended up in a completely different career. I considered the question carefully. Margaret, 6 months ago, I thought success meant keeping my head down, avoiding conflict, and hoping that hard work would eventually be rewarded. Rick Thompson taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds seem impossible. I gestured toward the bustling service bays where our technicians were working on customer vehicles with a level of care and attention that would have been unimaginable at Thompson's shop. If Rick hadn't attacked me, I never would have discovered how much fraud was happening in this industry. I never would have learned that I had the strength to stand up to bullies and win. And I never would have had the opportunity to build something that could make a real difference in people's lives. Margaret smiled. So you're saying that Rick Thompson accidentally created his own worst nightmare by underestimating you? Exactly. He thought he could intimidate me into silence because I was young, broke, and driving an old car. What he didn't understand was that those experiences had taught me to recognize injustice and refuse to accept it. I looked out at the parking lot, where customers were coming and going with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from knowing you're being treated fairly. Rick Thompson spent years building a reputation as someone who couldn't be challenged. It took me 3 months to destroy that reputation completely, using nothing but the truth and the courage to speak it publicly. As we locked up the shop that evening, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that rainy night when I'd stopped to help Callista with her car. Wait, that was a different story. Since that day when my Honda's transmission started failing, and I'd made the mistake of trusting Rick Thompson to fix it honestly. The experience had cost me weeks of stress, humiliation, and professional uncertainty. But it had also taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never plan to fight. And that victory often comes not from being stronger than your opponent, but from being more determined to do what's right. Rick Thompson had thought he could destroy me by attacking my reputation and my opportunities. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to build something better than anything I could have imagined on my own. 6 months later, when Rick Thompson was sentenced to 18 months in prison for fraud and conspiracy charges, I was featured in the local newspaper as an example of how individual citizens can fight back against corporate corruption. The article included a photo of me standing in front of Riverside Automotive Excellence, surrounded by satisfied customers and proud employees. But the caption that meant the most to me was a quote from Patricia Williams, the first customer who'd been brave enough to speak at the Consumer Protection Forum. Alex Chen showed us that we didn't have to accept being cheated just because we looked like easy targets. She taught us that honest people can win if they're willing to stand together and fight for what's right. That's exactly what I'd hoped to accomplish when this whole journey began. Not just to clear my own name or build a successful business, but to prove that ordinary people have the power to challenge corruption and create something better. Rick Thompson had underestimated me because he judged people by their appearance and their circumstances. He thought that someone driving an old car and wearing thrift store clothes couldn't possibly pose a threat to his operation. He was wrong about that, just like he was wrong about almost everything else. And now, every time a customer walks into Riverside Automotive Excellence and receives honest, respectful service, it's a reminder that his attempt to destroy me had exactly the opposite effect of what he intended. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when living well means helping other people avoid the kind of treatment you once endured yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.